For the better part of a century, the United States government sent armed agents into the Appalachian Mountains to shut down illegal whiskey, and for the better part of that century, the moonshiners won. They hid stills inside caves so deep that agents refused to walk in. They drove without headlights on mountain roads at speeds that would terrify a man in daylight. One trick turned a funeral procession into a rolling whiskey delivery. Another launched a racing sport that still fills stadiums across the South. And a third kept the family still hidden for years using nothing but a barefoot child on a ridge. Hit subscribe, because these mountain families outsmarted federal agents with tools you could find in any Appalachian barn. Here are 25 moonshine tricks Appalachian bootleggers used to fool the revenuers. Number 25. Setting up a decoy still. Experienced moonshiners in the mountains of North Carolina and eastern Tennessee rarely operated without a backup plan, and the smartest backup was a still they wanted the revenuers to find. A bootlegger would set up a small beat-up pot, still on a piece of land he did not mind losing, usually a few ridges over from the real operation. He stocked it with just enough mash to look active, maybe left a fire pit with cold ashes and a few empty jars scattered around the clearing. When a revenue agent hiked in and smashed that decoy, he filed his report, collected his evidence, and moved on. Meanwhile, the actual still, the one producing 20 or 30 gallons a week, sat untouched in a hollow the agent never searched because he believed he had already found what he came for. Some operators ran 2 or 3 decoys at a time, each one just convincing enough to earn a raid. Every smashed decoy bought another month of production on the real site. Number 24. The smokeless fire. Smoke was the fastest way to get caught. A column of white rising out of the trees on a still morning told every revenue agent within miles exactly where to look. So bootleggers learned to burn only seasoned hardwood, cut months ahead of time and dried until it barely hissed in the flame. Oak and hickory burned down to a bed of red coals that threw serious heat without sending up a visible plume. Some moonshiners went further and dug a trench under the firebox so the heat traveled through a channel in the ground before reaching the pot. By the time any wisp of smoke made it above the tree line, it was thin enough to vanish against the sky. Number 23. Running the still in bad weather. A clear, calm night was the worst time to make whiskey. Sound carried for miles. Smoke drifted straight up. The smell of fermenting corn hung in the air like a flag. So the smartest moonshiners waited for rain. A hard downpour scattered the scent in every direction, soaked the ground enough to kill any smoke trail, and made the mountain roads so slick that no government vehicle was getting up the hollow anyway. Heavy fog worked nearly as well. Some operators in the higher elevations timed their runs to match the cloud line, firing up the still only when the mist sat thick enough to cut visibility to a few dozen feet. A revenue agent could be standing on the next ridge over and see nothing at all. Number 22. Keeping hound dogs at the approach trail. Long before any alarm system existed, Appalachian moonshiners had something better. A good hound could hear a man walking through dry leaves from a quarter-mile out and would start baying the moment the footsteps did not belong to someone it recognized. Bootleggers kept 2 or 3 dogs tied near the approach trail, not at the still itself, so the warning came early enough to shut everything down. Some families trained the dogs to bark in a specific pattern, one cadence for a familiar neighbor and a different one for a stranger on the ridge. The dogs were not there for protection. They were there for time. Even a few minutes of warning was enough to douse the fire, hide the jars, and scatter into the woods before anyone arrived. Number 21. Burying the finished product. A moonshiner could have the cleanest operation in the county, but if a revenue agent found 40 jars of untaxed whiskey stacked in the barn, the case was already made. So the finished product went into the ground. Mason jars were sealed tight with wax, wrapped in burlap, and buried in holes dug into the hillside or along creek banks where the soil was soft. Some bootleggers hid their stash beneath the floor of a chicken coop, knowing that no agent wanted to dig through a yard of manure on a hunch. Others placed jars inside hollow logs and rolled the logs into a thicket. The rule was simple. If you could not see it from the road and you could not smell it from the porch, it did not exist. Number 20. The thump keg. Most people think of moonshine as a single pass through a pot still, but the sharpest Appalachian operators added a second stage called a thump keg. This was a small sealed barrel placed between the pot and the condenser. When the hot vapor from the first boil hit the liquid sitting inside the thump keg, it redistilled on contact, producing a smoother, higher proof spirit in one run. The trick here was not about taste, it was about detection. A cleaner distillate gave off far less of that raw, sharp corn smell that agents were trained to recognize. A single-run batch could stink up a whole hollow. A thumped batch was nearly odorless by comparison. That difference bought some moonshiners years of uninterrupted operation because the noses that were supposed to find them had nothing to follow. Number 19. Testing the proof by the bead. A bootlegger could not exactly walk into town and buy a hydrometer without raising questions, so they tested their product the old way, by shaking the jar and reading the bubbles. Good whiskey at the right proof threw a ring of tiny, even bubbles that clung to the surface for a few seconds before fading. Moonshiners called that ring the bead. Too much water, and the bubbles disappeared instantly. Too hot, and the bead broke apart into large, uneven clusters. An experienced operator could read the proof within a few points just by holding the jar up to sunlight and giving it one sharp shake. No equipment, no paper trail, nothing a revenue agent could confiscate and hold up in a courtroom, just a man, a jar, and a steady hand. Number 18. Moving the still every few weeks. A permanent still was a dead still. Revenue agents built cases slowly, watching a site for days or weeks before making their move. So the smartest bootleggers never gave them the chance. They broke the still down into pieces that two men could carry on their backs, hauled everything to a new spot deeper in the woods, and had it reassembled before the next batch of mash was ready to run. Some operators kept 3 or 4 prepared sites scattered across the ridgeline, each one cleared and leveled with stones already in place for the firebox. They rotated through them the way a farmer rotates crops. By the time an informant tipped off the agents and they hiked into the last known location, the ground was cold, the ashes were scattered, and the bootlegger was already running 5 hollows over. Number 17. Building the still inside a cave or an abandoned mine. The Appalachian Mountains are riddled with limestone caves and old coal mine shafts that had been cut and abandoned long before Prohibition started, and moonshiners put every one of them to work. A still set up deep inside a cave was invisible from the air, invisible from any trail, and naturally cool year-round, which made the condensing process more efficient without needing to haul creek water. The rock walls absorbed the heat from the firebox, and the exhaust vented through cracks and fissures in the ceiling so gradually that by the time any trace of it reached the surface, it had cooled and dispersed into nothing. No smoke above the tree line, no steam rising off the condenser, no telltale smell of cooking corn drifting through the hollow. Some cave stills in eastern Kentucky and southwestern Virginia ran for years without a single agent ever finding them. The entrances were disguised with brush, fallen timber, or arranged rock slides that looked perfectly natural to anyone who did not know exactly where to put their foot. In the coal country of West Virginia, bootleggers used abandoned mine tunnels that ran deep enough underground to swallow every sound the still made. The operation sat hundreds of feet inside the mountain, behind turns and drops that no outsider could navigate without a guide. Revenue agents who did manage to locate these setups faced a decision none of them wanted to make. walk single file into a pitch-black tunnel on somebody else's ground, knowing the man inside knew the layout, and they did not. Most agents chose to stake out the entrance and wait. That rarely worked either. The caves and mines often had back passages that opened onto a completely different ridge, and by the time the agents realized they were watching an empty hole, the moonshiner was 2 hollows away eating supper. Number 16. Filtering through charred wood. Raw moonshine straight off the still has a yellowish tint and a sharp bite that no one would mistake for water. Bootleggers who needed to move their product past checkpoints or sell it in town had to fix that. The solution was charcoal. They burned a batch of sugar maple or hickory down to coals, crushed it into coarse pieces, packed it into a hollowed log or a cloth sack, and poured the raw whiskey through it slowly. The charcoal pulled out the harsh oils and most of the color, leaving behind a liquid nearly as clear as creek water. Pour that into a plain glass jar, and a revenue agent inspecting the truck had nothing to go on. It looked like water. It poured like water. Unless the agent opened the lid and took a deep breath, the jar passed right through. Number 15. Hiding the product in everyday household containers. A jar of clear moonshine sitting on a shelf was an invitation for a raid, and bootleggers across Appalachia knew it. So they poured their whiskey into anything that looked like it belonged in a kitchen or a barn. Lard cans were a favorite. A 5-gallon lard tin with a thin layer of actual lard floating on top could pass any casual inspection because nobody wanted to stick a hand into a bucket of cold grease. Some used ceramic vinegar jugs, others filled cleaned-out molasses cans, and a few poured their shine into glass preserving jars and packed them in a crate of actual canned peaches or tomatoes, 3 rows of peaches on top, moonshine underneath. The revenuers knew about the obvious tricks, the false bottom wagons, the hollowed-out logs, but a woman carrying a tin of lard to a neighbor's house never drew a second look. The product moved through the community in plain sight because it looked exactly like everything else in a mountain pantry. Number 14. Cutting false trails through the woods. Revenue agents working the mountains relied heavily on footpaths and broken brush to locate stills. The moonshiners knew this, and they used it against them. A bootlegger would deliberately clear a visible trail leading away from the real still site and toward a dead end, a cliff face, or a stretch of briars thick enough to turn a grown man around. Some operators set up decoy sites at the end of the false trail, a ring of old stones, a rusty bucket, some scattered ash, just enough to make it look like a still had been there and been abandoned. The agent would spend half a day hiking in, find the cold decoy, write his report, and move on. Meanwhile, the real still was running a quarter-mile away, accessible only by a path that started behind a rock face no outsider would think to check. Number 13. Feeding the spent mash to livestock. After the whiskey was distilled, the leftover mash was a problem. A pile of fermenting grain sitting in the woods smelled exactly like what it was, and the scent could lead a revenue agent straight to the operation. So moonshiners fed it to their hogs and cattle. The animals ate it readily, and within a day, the evidence was gone. This served a second purpose. A revenue agent who showed up at a farm and saw well-fed livestock had no reason to be suspicious. The corn was accounted for. The feed was on the ground. Everything looked like a normal working farm. In some hollows, the hogs were said to stagger around a bit after eating a particularly fresh batch of spent mash, but no law on the books ever made it a crime to own a dizzy pig. Number 12. Pouring out the product when agents closed in. Without physical evidence, a moonshine case fell apart in court. Bootleggers knew this better than anyone, and many of them kept their finished whiskey in jars with loose lids for exactly that reason. The moment the dogs started barking or a lookout sent a signal, the first thing a moonshiner did was start dumping. Jars went into the creek. Jugs got emptied onto the ground. Some operators smashed their own equipment with a sledgehammer before the agents could reach the clearing. It looked like destruction, but it was pure strategy. A revenue agent could stand in a clearing that reeked of corn whiskey, surrounded by broken glass and wet stones, and still have nothing he could bring to a courtroom. No product meant no evidence. No evidence meant no conviction. The smell of good whiskey soaking into the dirt was the price of staying free. Number 11. Speaking entirely in code. Moonshine communities developed their own vocabulary for the trade, and none of it sounded like anything worth investigating if an outsider happened to overhear. A batch of whiskey was called a load of produce. Sugar was sweetening. The still was a cooker. A distilling run was a cooking. Revenue agents were the law, or simply strangers, and everyone in the hollow understood what those words meant without needing it spelled out. Orders were placed at church, at the general store, or across a fence line, and nothing in the conversation would raise a flag with anyone who did not already know the language. Even the location of a still was communicated in terms that sounded like directions to a fishing hole. By the time a federal agent worked out what half the local talk actually meant, the season was finished and the still was packed away. Number 10. The dead drop. The most dangerous moment in the moonshine trade was the handoff. If a revenue agent caught a buyer and a seller in the same place with product between them, both went to jail. So bootleggers eliminated the meeting entirely. The moonshiner left the whiskey at a prearranged location, a hollow tree, a gap under a rock ledge, or a spot beside a specific fence post along a back road. The buyer came by later, picked up the jars, and left payment in the same spot. Neither party saw the other face to face. There were no witnesses, no handshake, and no moment where the product and the money sat in the same pair of hands. Some of these arrangements ran for years, with the buyer and the seller communicating only through the drop point itself. A jar left upside down meant the price had changed. 2 jars standing side by side meant come back tomorrow. Number 9. False bottom vehicles. Getting moonshine out of the mountains and into the towns where the buyers lived meant crossing roads that revenue agents patrolled regularly. The solution was a vehicle that looked like it was carrying something legal. Bootleggers built false floors into their trucks, wagons, and later their cars, creating hidden compartments beneath a visible load of hay, firewood, or crates of produce. A revenue agent who stopped the truck and checked the bed would see exactly what he expected. A farmer headed to market with a load of oak or a stack of apple crates. The whiskey sat in flat containers, wedged into the space between the real floor and the false one, packed tight enough that nothing shifted or clinked when the truck hit a rut. Some builders got so skilled at the work that the compartment was undetectable even to an agent who climbed into the bed and stomped around. Number 8. Women carrying the product past checkpoints. Revenue agents in the early 20th century operated under a set of social rules that moonshiners exploited without hesitation. Searching a woman in public was considered deeply unacceptable, and most agents would not do it even when they had strong suspicions. Bootlegger families used this to full advantage. Women walked into town wearing heavy coats with jars strapped flat to their bodies, or carried baskets with whiskey hidden beneath layers of cloth and baked goods. Some wore specially sewn garments with interior pockets that held thin tin containers of whiskey against the torso, completely invisible under a dress. A woman carrying a covered basket down a country road drew no attention whatsoever. She looked like any farm wife headed to a neighbor's house with food. The agents who did grow suspicious had almost no recourse. Stopping and searching a woman on a public road would have turned the entire community against them overnight. Number 7. Posting children as lookouts on the ridgeline. This is the trick the government never found an answer for. Across Appalachia, bootleggers stationed their own children and grandchildren on the high ground above the still, sometimes starting from the time those children were old enough to walk the ridge on their own. The job was straightforward. Sit on a rock at the top of the hollow, watch the trail below, and if a stranger appeared, Send the signal. The signals varied from family to family. Some children used bird calls, a whippoorwill whistle that sounded completely natural to anyone who did not know what it really meant. Others used a piece of mirror glass to flash sunlight down toward the still site. In a few families, the warning was nothing more than a specific song, hummed loudly enough to carry down the slope through the trees. The children never had to say a word to the agents. They were just kids sitting on a hillside, and no federal officer in the country was going to arrest a child for watching birds. What made this trick so effective was not just the early warning it provided. It was the fact that revenue agents had no legal tool to counter it. They could not arrest the children. They could not force them to testify. They could not even prove the children were doing anything at all. A barefoot kid perched on a rock with a piece of broken mirror was not a crime in any statute. And by the time the agents hiked up the trail, the still was cold, the jars were underground, and the moonshiner was sitting on his front porch whittling a stick. Entire families ran this system across generations. A grandmother who had been a ridge lookout in the 1920s taught her own granddaughter the same bird call decades later. The technique outlasted Prohibition itself and kept working for as long as there were hollows deep enough and ridge lines high enough to make it matter. Number 6. Driving without headlights on mountain roads. When moonshine had to move at night, visibility was the enemy. A pair of headlights winding down a mountain road was practically a signed confession because no farmer had a legitimate reason to be driving an overloaded car through a hollow at 2 in the morning. So bootleggers drove blind. They memorized every curve, every dip, every patch of loose gravel on their regular routes, and they ran them in total darkness at speeds that would have rattled a sober man in broad daylight. Some drivers wrapped their headlights in cloth and only flipped them on for a split second to check a blind turn before going dark again. The revenue agents trailing behind had to choose between running their own lights, which gave away their position completely, or matching the bootleggers' darkness and risking the ditch. Most of them ended up in the ditch. Number 5. Souping up the car engine. If running dark did not work, the backup plan was simpler. Go faster than anything the government owned. Appalachian bootleggers became some of the finest shade tree mechanics in the country out of pure necessity. They took stock Ford coupes and Chevrolet sedans and rebuilt them from the frame up, boring out the cylinders, bolting on extra carburetors, stiffening the springs to handle a full load of whiskey jars without bottoming out, and stripping everything from the cabin that was not bolted to the steering column. From the outside, a bootlegger's car looked like any other farm sedan rolling down a county road. Under the hood, it was a different machine entirely. Revenue agents driving standard government-issue vehicles could not keep up on a straight road and had no chance at all on the twisting mountain lanes where the bootlegger had been driving since he was old enough to reach the pedals. This arms race between moonshiners and the law did not end when the whiskey stopped flowing. The skills those drivers had built and the cars they had modified became the foundation of an entirely new American tradition. After Prohibition, the drivers kept racing. They set up informal tracks on old pastures and county fairgrounds across the Carolina Piedmont and the Georgia foothills, running the same modified sedans they had once used to outrun federal agents, this time for prize money and bragging rights in front of crowds that knew exactly where those driving skills had been learned. Those dirt track races grew into organized events, then a regional circuit, and eventually into stock car racing as the rest of the country came to know it. Some of the earliest successful drivers in the sport had spent their younger years hauling jars of white whiskey through the same turns they later raced on for trophies. Number 4. Using funeral processions to move whiskey. Of all the tricks on this list, this one required the most nerve. In mountain communities where funerals were sacred and grief was deeply respected, a procession of black-clad mourners following a hearse down a country road was the one thing no revenue agent would dare to stop. Bootleggers took advantage of that reverence. They built coffins with false bottoms, loaded the lower compartment with jars of moonshine, placed a thin wooden divider across the middle, and laid the body, or in some cases just a weighted dummy, on top. The procession moved slowly and solemnly through town, past any checkpoint, and out toward a burial ground on the other side of the county. The whiskey was unloaded at the destination and distributed from there. In some cases, the funeral was entirely real. A family that had just lost a relative saw no contradiction in using the occasion to move product along with the casket. The dead were honored with the same songs and prayers they would have received regardless, and the whiskey rode along underneath because the trade did not pause for grief, and grief did not pause for the trade. Revenue agents who heard rumors about this practice faced a situation with no good outcome. Stopping a funeral procession to pry open a coffin would have been a scandal that destroyed the agency's standing in the community for years. Even agents who were fairly certain a casket was loaded with jars generally let the procession pass rather than face the fallout of being wrong or the uglier fallout of being right and having to prove it in front of a grieving family on the shoulder of a public road. The trick worked because it placed its bet on the one thing the federal government could never afford to publicly violate: the dignity of the dead. Number 3. Paying off the local sheriff. The simplest trick on this list was also one of the most widespread. In many Appalachian counties, the local sheriff was not just aware of the moonshine trade. He was part of it. A bootlegger who paid the sheriff a regular share, sometimes in cash, sometimes in whiskey, bought something that no amount of cleverness in the woods could ever guarantee: advance warning. A cooperative sheriff tipped off a moonshiner before a federal raid was coming, delayed serving a warrant long enough for the still to be moved, or simply patrolled in the other direction when a delivery was scheduled to run. Federal agents sent in from outside the county quickly learned that local law enforcement was often the last place to look for help. Some sheriffs were so deeply tied into the moonshine economy that they had been elected specifically because the community knew they would leave the stills alone. The badge was not the law. It was the cover. Number 2. Labeling moonshine as medicine. During Prohibition, the law allowed one narrow exception for alcohol. A licensed physician could prescribe whiskey for medicinal purposes, and a pharmacist could fill that prescription legally. Bootleggers in Appalachia turned that loophole into a supply line. In some counties, sympathetic doctors wrote prescriptions by the stack, often for patients they had never examined, and the whiskey that filled those orders came straight from the same stills the government was trying to shut down. The product was bottled in plain glass, labeled as a tonic or a liniment, and sold across the counter at drugstores that everyone in town understood were moving moonshine in broad daylight. The federal agents assigned to enforce Prohibition in those communities had to prove that the whiskey sitting on the pharmacy shelf was not the whiskey listed on the prescription, a distinction that was nearly impossible to establish when the doctor, the pharmacist, and the bootlegger were all cooperating and none of them were willing to say a word. Number 1. The Code of the Hills. No trick on this list worked without this one. In every hollow, on every ridge, in every small mountain community where moonshine was made, there was one rule that held the entire operation together. Nobody talked. Not to agents, not to outsiders, not to anyone who was not family or close enough to be considered family. Revenue agents who came into Appalachian communities asking questions were met with a silence so complete it might as well have been a stone wall. Neighbors who had watched a still run for years looked a federal man in the eye and swore they had never seen a thing. Storekeepers who sold sugar by the 100-pound sack said they had no idea what their customers wanted it for. Even people who had no part in the moonshine trade and wanted nothing to do with it understood that talking to the government meant putting a neighbor's livelihood and family at risk, and in those mountains, that was a line you did not cross. The code was never written down. It was never enforced with threats or violence. It held because the people living in those hollows had survived together through generations of poverty and isolation that the federal agents writing up their case files would never fully understand. Loyalty to your own was not a decision anyone sat down and made. It was simply how life worked in a place where the only thing standing between your family and hardship was the family on the next ridge over. Not a single one of these tricks required anything the mountain did not already provide. Creek water, charred wood, a child on a ridge, a neighbor who knew when to say nothing. Some were clever, some were desperate. All of them came from communities that had been making whiskey in these mountains long before the government decided it was a crime. If one of these surprised you more than the rest, put it in the comments. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is a good time. More stories like this are coming.